welcome to another edition of Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday. And today I'm in conversation with Lauren Yero, and it is so great to meet you. I have to tell people, because every time I have to get a shout out to Susan James, the famous book dealer in the world. Susan and I have been friends for a long time, so much so that I think we trust each other enough. If she recommends an author, I'm interested. And if I recommend an author, she's interested. So that's kind of how we connected is Susan said, do you know this book? And I said, no, I don't. Well, you should, and she connected us. So welcome, Lauren. We're glad to have you in this conversation.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and so good to meet you too.
So the first thing is, how did you meet Susan? Did she find you at some reading, or have you known her for a long time, or what's that connection?
No, we met through Nora. Nora Shalloway Carpenter is another YA author, and she introduced us because we were doing a panel together for the YAL Teachers Summit. And so we met that way. So we're very recent connection.
Very good. Well, Nora is a good friend of the blog, and Nora and I have known each other for a while, so that's a great connection. I should have, because I only was tangentially connected with the summit last year and attended just a couple of things. So that's good. If you know Nora, and that was going to be one of my questions, because where you're living in North Carolina, I said, I wonder if she's kind of run into Nora and has
Yeah.
those conversations about people who write in the wild in some things. The Appalachian connection is
Yeah. And Nora and I, we write we're in very different genres, but we both have these kind of shared environmental concerns in our writing. And
yeah.
so I was at her most recent book launch here at Malaprops in Asheville, and then we've done a couple of in-person things together, and then the online summit. So it's a pretty rich landscape for writers out here for
Oh,
sure.
that's good. I love that. Yeah, I liked Fault Lines. Nora's book was really great too. So I think she's coming along. So let's talk about you. So you say, tell us a little bit about your book that's been out almost a year now, right?
Great.
The launch was last summer sometime, so you're probably 9 months into it. So tell us about the book. Here we have, yay.
Yeah, so the book came out last July. It's out through Simon and Schuster, and it comes out in paperback this summer. So it is sort of a speculative fiction, I call it. It's a little bit dystopian. It's set in the near future, in a near future version of Chile, in a world that is divided by walls. And so in the novel, it's told from two different perspectives. Well, it's told sort of from three perspectives, but primarily there are two main characters. And they're both teens. So one of them, this guy here, his name is Rumi, and he comes from inside of the walls. So these protected walls that are protect these cities all across the world from the kind of global conflict and environmental devastation going on outside. And then this character, Paz, she comes from outside the walls. And so the two of them end up having to come together to go on this journey, and they're searching for a cure for this mysterious, very deadly virus. Rumi needs the cure to save his father's life. Um, Paz is ostensibly guiding him and helping him to find this cure, but in reality, she is working for the very same rebels who are responsible for infecting his father in the first place. And so plenty of drama ensues. On
Yeah.
paper, they are enemies, but of course, it turns out to be a lot more complicated than that.
Yes, it turns out to be a lot more complicated. So tell me how somebody who, on your website you label as Cuban American ends up setting a book in Chile. But as you told me as we got started that you didn't grow up speaking Spanish. So
That's
here
right.
you've got all this influence. So tell us a little bit about the background of how you came to decide on this setting, this locale. Okay.
Yeah. So, my my dad is Cuban. He was born in Cuba and raised in Miami. Um, and When I was growing up, we did not, because my mom doesn't speak Spanish. We didn't speak Spanish in our home. And so I was only kind of around Spanish when we would visit my grandparents. Um, and the relationship of Cuban Americans to Cuba and to Spanish is unique, and it's one in which there's, you know, some things are shared and then some things are kept from the next generation out of, I think it's a desire to just kind of give that next generation a clean slate, maybe without like the history that all of being Cuban American brought with it for, you know, for my dad, for instance.
Yeah.
Um, and so as I kind of came of age and was in my high school and college years, I just had this very strong desire to learn Spanish. And even though, you know, to identify as Latina, I didn't need to speak Spanish. For me personally, I felt the need to learn. And so I studied abroad in Spain. And after I finished college, I took a job as a travel writer in
Oh,
Chile. And so the reason was I wanted to improve my Spanish, and I wanted to get a lot, you know, more comfortable, and even if I would never be a native speaker, I wanted to be more fluent. And so I took that job, and that job is what led to kind of the seed of this novel.
yeah.
Um, it obviously, working as a travel writer and writing a speculative dystopian novel, there's a bit of a difference there, but I got the idea during my time in Chile, which was about so much more than just the travel writing that I was doing to kind of um, pay for my time there. Um,
Yeah.
and
That's
so,
that's those are
yeah.
really interesting connections from Spain to Chile, with a Cuban background. You know, some people would say you couldn't get probably three more diverse Spanish contexts, right?
Well, for sure. And I think people, you know, ask like, well, why didn't you go to Cuba? And it's like, well, if I could have found a job and lived in Cuba for 5 months, but that's not really very possible. It's a
Yeah.
different, it's a very different set of restrictions. And so
Yeah.
I sort of was, it was like a proxy, you know,
Yeah.
approximating. And yeah, you're right, that Spain Spanish and Cuban Spanish are very different. And then Chilean Spanish is an entirely other thing. Like I went to Chile and started speaking the Spanish that I had learned, and my ear just wasn't tuned to Chilean Spanish. And it took me a little while to, I was like, maybe I don't even speak Spanish, but it was just that Chilean Spanish is so different. And so, you know, when I was writing this book, there is a lot of Spanish in the book. And because I am not a Chilean Spanish speaker, we had a number of Chileans read the novel and kind of like get that real like Chilean flavor into, and slang and all of that into the Spanish that's in the book. So that was a really important part of it too.
Yeah, that's great. I have a friend who, an academic who travels to Chile almost every year for the last 20 years and does a summer program. And I learned my Spanish. At one time I was really fluent, but I learned in Argentina, which
Mm.
again is another, they claim they don't speak Spanish, they speak Castellano, right?
Ya no.
And, and then and then having been to Spain, I love Spain. We've been to Spain several times. Um, and then I had an assignment once where I was attending a place where there was Dominican and Honduras and Puerto Rican Spanish. And I thought, I came home after 2 or 3 hours immersed in that just with a headache because they think, oh, maybe I don't speak any Spanish whatsoever.
And I would venture to say Chilean is like perhaps the one Spanish um subset that where like experimentation is so valued and like just play. And so they bring in like they'll conjugate an English word with Spanish verb
Yeah,
conjugation, like, and it's just it's like it's this delight in playing with language that is so fun and also extremely difficult as someone coming in for the first
yeah.
time trying to, yeah.
I spent a lot of my time in Argentina and Buenos Aires, which is heavily influenced by Italian influence. So much so that a lot of their slang is is some version of Italian. And when I came back and I did a FSI test, a foreign service test years ago, and they were evaluating what level of Spanish you spoke at. And the guy said, "You learned in Argentina, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah, why?" And he said, "Because all your slang is, Argentine. It's not really Spanish slang, right?" And he says, and I had no notion of that. Then I just learned what I learned, right? After 2 years of being immersed in a culture, then you think, oh, I know this Spanish, but it's
Mm,
not the same when
yep,
you go from one place to the other. So
yep.
that's fascinating that you incorporated that learning in that. So tell us a little bit more when you say speculative, and you've got Spanish and Chile, but you've also got this environmental bent in it. So what are some of the issues that drove you to that, and how do you think readers or critics or people who are looking at your book are responding to the environmental issues?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, to kind of classify the novel, it definitely exists under that umbrella of speculative fiction, which just means fiction that is in some way departing from the world as we know it. And I would say it hews more toward sci-fi, but being in that like Latin American culture, it also has a little bit of magical realism, I would say. If that's not the dominant, but it definitely has a bit of that, especially at play with this third narrative voice, the storyteller. She's sort of she's a character that kind of comes in and out, and you're not exactly sure how like whether she's in the story or whether she's telling the story. She's kind of elusive, at least at the beginning. And she tells these very kind of fantastical tales. And so I think her role is in that more magical realist space, but the novel itself, I think, is a bit more sci-fi. Not
Yeah,
hard sci-fi, but near
yeah,
future.
I can see that. That's a really good description of that. So do you see some of the Chilean writers or some of the people involved with magical realism, Marquez or Allende or some of these others, and some are really located in Chile, but others are through Mexico. Do you see those? Are those people you were reading when you were in school, or?
I wouldn't say I read them in school, but I certainly read them outside of school. And I would say one of my biggest influences just as a writer generally, not only in this book, but is Jorge Luis Borges. Like he is
Yeah.
my
Oh,
he's and he exists within that space as well.
yeah,
Very much though in this kind of realm of ideas. And I take a lot of inspiration from him and from Italo Calvino, who is also kind of in that space as well.
yeah.
Um, but
Borges is great. I wish more people were, doing some Borges short stories and other things along the way in high schools, because he's certainly, yeah,
incredible. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
he's incredible. I remember reading, after having been in Argentina, reading Quiroga and Borges and some of the Argentine writers who are largely ignored, in contemporary classes. But that's another subject altogether. But the influences, I think, are there. But certainly the number one connection people would make automatically if you say magical realism in Chile would be Allende. I think
For
would
sure.
start there.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think, I mean, House of Spirits was something that I had read recently before I started writing
Hmm.
the novel, and so that was definitely fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
Um, and there is quite a bit, I think, especially people who are born of diaspora write
Right.
intergenerational kind of stories. Like it's stories where you're thinking of heritage and futurity simultaneously. And so House of Spirits certainly is like a prime example of that,
Yeah.
um, of these multi-generations of like passing down just the that sort of lineage. And I think this novel also does that to some extent, certainly not to the same extent, but there's definitely this like tension between the older generation and the protagonist's generation, and then what's going to come. So your question about the environmental influences,
Mhm.
um, I mean, personally, I think it's hard to be alive right now and not be thinking about that stuff, you know? And so you write what is top of mind. You write the things that are troubling you and the questions that you have. And I think the question that was motivating this novel is, especially in an environmental context, what do we owe to one another in this interconnected world that we live in, where one action that we might take over here has this completely unexpected effect or seemingly disconnected effect over here? And what do we owe each other across that distance and that difference, when our actions so intimately affect one another? And I studied we talked just before that we got on this recording that I did my graduate work at University of Nevada, Reno. And at the time when when I was there, that was sort of the hub for environmental literature. And so a lot of the people who were
Yeah.
working in the field of eco-criticism, which is literature that exists within an environmental discourse, were based there. And so that was where a lot of people wanting to study that came. And so that's where I got my graduate degree. And my focus was somewhat on post-colonial eco-criticism. And so I read one of the books that deeply affected me and that I mentioned in the author note of Under This Forgetful Sky is a book of literary criticism by a South African critic named Rob Nixon. It's called Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And in that work, he's essentially asking this question of how do we tell stories when he talks about this concept of slow violence, which is a type of violence that is often not recognized as violence because it unfolds across such vast distances of time and space. And so it's difficult to identify an action and an effect. And that is sort of, he is speaking specifically about corporate entities that use that to their
Yeah.
advantage.
Yeah.
And
Oh, and yeah, the record's not good, right? If we look at it carefully, the record's horrible, right?
yeah. And so he speaks, like, if we want to get a little in the weeds on this, he speaks about specifically like the Bhopal chemical disaster and how after that, the corporate entity just rebranded itself as Dow Chemical, and then they didn't have any more responsibility. And so it's like this sense of like, well, you know, we can just pivot in that way because we're not actually a physical body, but the physical bodies in that physical space and the physical communities are the ones feeling the impact of that. And that just, I don't know, that something about that and the way that he frames it and the way that it caused me to think differently just about the world. I was like, well, what kind of stories can get at that, at the heart of that tension and that like
Yeah.
that question? And I was like, speculative stories, because they can see into the future. And so you're
Yeah.
reading it, you're like manifesting across time because you're reading it in this present moment, but you're seeing it through the lens of this future world. And that felt very powerful to me. And so that's kind of where the environmental piece came in,
Yeah.
of like trying to explore those ideas.
See, that's I think a really powerful kind of framing of your book, because I think for somebody who's been reading and talking about young adult literature for 20 years, I think we discount how sophisticated many readers can be. Now, I would say also that adolescents are often narrow readers. They'll read only romance or only sci-fi or only fantasy for a long time. But more and more, we have writers like you and Nora and I think others who do things, kind of surrealistic, are talking about things in ways in which the way they frame the context of the world of their book allows teens to start seeing or imagining different answers than we've given them, certainly in my generation. And I'm clearly a generation or two ahead of you, right? I sometimes think that our generation that was built largely on the 60s and early 70s has felt miserably in their idealism. We had an idealism that was going to do things and going to change the world, and we haven't fulfilled that in policy like I wish we would have, right? So many have gone on and to do other things, many which are good, but many which are, I would say, failed opportunities to live up to the promise of an idealism that maybe collectively we haven't achieved again. So I think your book and books like yours give kids a way of imagining solutions, especially when you talk about rejecting a generation. And I'm sitting here thinking of all kinds of books that plow what is the legacy of the generation, and how much of it do we want to adopt, and how much of it do we want to reject or modify. Maybe reject is too harsh of a word, as we envision a world that's more harmonious, more successful in tackling problems. So I like that a lot, Lauren. Thank you for helping me frame that. I'll have new ways to talk about your book and others like that as I think about that some more.
Yeah, and I was gonna try to find this. It makes me think of this one passage from The Storyteller. I don't know if I can find it right off the top of my head, but so in speaking about rejecting previous generations, or what do we, like what do we bring forward into the future and what do we leave behind? A lot of the older characters in the novel are trying to um, predetermine what these young characters will do, and trying to kind of tell them in a very prescribed way what they think is right, and limiting their options. But the storyteller, she speaks with much more openness, and she acknowledges that there's a moment, and like I said, I'd have to hunt for it, and I won't take the time to do that now, but she basically says, like, if I tell you this one thing, then you'll come to me with the exact opposite. It's sort of paraphrasing, like, um if I tell you the earth is something to be feared, you'll come to me with the dragon's head in your hand. Something like that, where it's like,
Yeah.
I know that anything that I tell to you and say this is the way it is, you're going to prove me wrong. And so why don't I tell you stories, and you figure out what you're going to do with those stories? And that's kind of like what I think the book is trying to do, is like, it's not trying to give an answer to these questions. It's trying to just give a set of, explore the questions and have the reader kind of figure out what they think about them. And because I think that young people don't really like to be told what to do. It's definitely kind of a universal truth that a young person,
Yeah.
if you tell them what to do, they're not going to do it. So
Yeah. Try to see if they can do the opposite. But I think that's something to really be explored, because it used to be in the early days of young adult literature, they'd say, well, one of the characteristics is the statement, "No, mom, I can do it myself." And so there's a sense of absence of parents, where the adolescents are trying to explore the problem. I think there has grown recently, and I'd be hard pressed to put a date on it, whether I said the last 10 years or so, but there are more books now where the adults are present and in conversation, and often in conflict with the adolescents in ways that they were not in the early years of adolescent literature. So I think I'm not writing these, but people like you and others who are writing adolescent fiction are writing more complex conversations between the generations, and having a more inclusive discussion of the problems or the things that need to be handled. And we could go even something all the way back to something like Ender's Game, a pure science fiction thing where these children are seen as the saving grace of the world, but in so many ways they're manipulated so heavily by the adults that's one of the problems with the main character, is he rebels completely when he realizes how manipulated he's been and, you know, wants to do that. So I think you're talking about a trend that I think is becoming more and more apparent in what I would call sophisticated young adult literature, especially young adult literature that's kind of written for older audiences with serious themes, that are more than, well, is there anything more than let me tell you a story? I mean, I was saying that, I don't mean that to be reductionist, because I think that's one of the ways we solve the world's problems is we tell a better story and we try to then live a better story, right?
Yeah. And I mean, here's an admission is that I actually had not read a lot of young adult literature when I started writing this. Um, the story came to me and I realized that it was a coming of age story. I realized
Mm-hmm.
that it was most interesting to tell this story from the perspective of these two characters who were coming of age in this world that they did not create, but they had to decide how they were going to act and who they were going to become within the context of that world. And I thought that was the most interesting story to tell rather than someone who was fully grown. Um, and so I actually had to educate myself
Yeah,
like give myself kind of a crash course in YA
yeah,
and quickly found that yeah, there's definitely like this divide between YA for a younger audience, for the like
yeah,
um upper middle school who is kind of reading a little bit up, and then there's the YA for the older, the older audience that's like more of a high school audience. And yeah, they can do very, very different things. Like the ones that are just graduating from middle grade into something a little bit more with teen concerns, but kind of still has a bit more of a middle
yeah,
grade feel versus something that's like just on its way to being for adults, or that's like in that crossover space.
yeah.
I think this book is definitely closer to that.
Oh yeah, I think so. And I've been doing it long enough, you know, and a little bit on the historian side of, you know, young adult literature and what the trends have been, that it's changed really radically since I've been engaged as an academic. So I was really engaged from 2002 or three on. So 20 years, the definition and what we're seeing, and you know, no one was classifying anything as middle grades 20 years ago, and now we, you know, it's kind of a whole classification of middle grades versus something else. And it'll are you going to have the same cover on the paperback?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that, because that's an interesting thing that happens as well, is how covers might change based on how a publisher sees it received in the
Mhm.
first wave, right?
Yeah, and
They might say, oh, it's going to go up, we need to change the cover, or it's gone down a little bit in terms of who the audience is, so let's change the cover. Um, and so I think it's a very interesting um, thing to consider. So I'd be interested to see what they show you the cover is going to be. If it stays the same, that'll be interesting.
yeah,
So
well, I think it will stay the same for the paperback, but it'll have like the reviews and things that have come in
on the
on the
cover, yeah,
back. But if you look at it, I mean, when you read the novel, I don't think the very first thing you think of is romance, but they definitely are kind of highlighting. It's a very kind of romantic feeling to the cover,
yeah,
which is this effort to bring in those readers who are
right.
looking for that romantic component. It's definitely not a romance, like I think romance readers who are coming expecting the very specific elements of a romance. That's not what this is, but there is a love story
Yeah,
that's
there
in
is a
there.
love story, but you're right. There's certainly something else that's I think as far as storytelling is more sophisticated than telling us a basic love story with complications. So, how long have you been considering yourself a writer of fiction? Because you did nonfiction writing for a while. So, tell us your journey into saying, "Oh, I must write a novel," or have you been doing that since the sixth grade and just getting around to it?
So internally, I think I've thought of myself as a writer in a serious way since third grade. Third grade was when I wrote my first novel. Novel. It was, the school that I went to had a pretty amazing emphasis on creative writing, and so we would have specific time set aside for just writing, working on our books, and then there was at the end of each, I guess, year or maybe it was quarter, I'm not sure, we would do a young authors day, and so we would invite
Oh,
community members to come in and we would get to read our books. And so I wrote what I considered a novel. It was an involved story about a young girl, and she was orphaned and she discovers she was a princess. And I thought it was a very, you know, uh, original concept that, oh, and she finds out, little did I know that that was definitely a trope that had been done before, but I was very proud of it at the time. And and then in fifth grade, we had this school-wide Caldecott and Newbery honor, and I won the Newbery in fifth grade.
oh,
I was like, well, this is my mandate. I must be a writer. Um, but it was the external piece of it was, one thing, but it was just something that I felt just so it was so much a part of my own way that I viewed myself from such a young age. It was like before I knew very much about myself at all, I knew that I was a writer. In middle school, I tried to write poetry, but I would realize very quickly that I write stories. Like that is the way that I like to explore the difficult truths of the world and the beautiful truths of the world is through story. And so, yeah, I went to college and studied literature. I got an English degree, and took as many creative writing classes as I
as you
could.
could.
And I wrote a creative thesis, which was a collection of short stories as like an honors thesis in undergrad. And then I just didn't really know how to become a writer, and I didn't have a novel idea yet. And so I was playing around with some short stories and, just like doing that on my own and thinking, well, I need to go into academia because that's a place that I feel familiar with and comfortable with, and I like to teach. And so I did graduate work in this academic, like a more critical field, and then ended up writing a novel as my capstone thesis for my ostensibly academic. It was not a creative master's degree. It was an MA.
Yeah.
But they let me do this because I had a lot of critical framework to back up the creative piece.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, I guess I'm a novelist. I just kept coming back to it, no matter where I tried to stray, it was like,
Yeah.
nope, story, story, story. So it was very much from the beginning. It took me a while to kind of fully step into it. But publicly, I think it wasn't until I had this book that I was able to say, you know what? I'm a teacher and a writer. I am both of those things, like as part of my just like more public identity.
No, that's great. Do you write with others? Do you have a writing group? Are you a lone voice in the wilderness writing your book, or what's your writing process like?
So my writing process is definitely I do on my own, but I have a collection of collection a group of trusted friends that I share my writing with, and that they share their writing with me. This was all pre-published
Yeah.
author. And so all of my writer friends, they're not published yet, but they aspire to be, and so we kind of support each other in that. But they're very like just I think that in writing this book and realizing how many times a book is written and rewritten,
Yeah.
I you realize what a treasure a really trusted friend who is a writer is in that process. And so I would sort of like, I do have a small group of writing buddies that we exchange writing more regularly, but when I had the full draft of this novel before I started shopping it around to agents, I would basically just send it to one person at a time because I didn't want to, I wanted to get their feedback, but then I didn't want to like waste,
Yeah.
like, because it was such a treasure to get a fresh set of eyes on a new
Yeah.
draft. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I can't imagine writing in complete isolation.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's very hard. I think most writers have, as I've learned this, I found out, oh, X writer was in a writing group with so and so, and these people, know each other, and sometimes I know their works independently and didn't know that they knew each other. And I think there's a lot of those little um, nodes of writers sitting out there, some who've been quite successful and some who are still trying to get done. So how many drafts do you say you maybe did then if you were shopping it around? Are you at 10, 20?
so it depends on what you consider a draft. So I had the first draft that was the first kind of complete draft that was my thesis for my graduate program. And I would say, it had the shape of the book. But it was a very different version.
Yeah.
And then I would sort of put it I was teaching, at one point I was teaching at the university level, and then I was teaching at the elementary level. Like I've taught all across the
Yeah.
spectrum. And so it was not like full-time thing that I
Yeah.
was doing. And so I had just these little pockets to write in. And so I would put it away and then take it back out, work on it for a period of time. I mean, I would say there were at least 5 different distinct versions,
Mhm.
that were meaningfully different from one another.
Yeah.
The original version didn't even have the storyteller. That was
Yeah.
storyteller came about in a later version, for a lot of reasons. And so there were kind of these distinct drafts, but at the same time, it was kind of like just a lot of piddling along for a bit and then really putting some work in. And then, it was about 10 years from when I
When
first
you
started writing it until
to
now. Yeah.
do that. Well, hopefully, you have an agent now, then you've got an agent,
Mhm.
then so you're pushing those things along and you published with a good press. So that's really good to see. So what's next?
Mm. Yeah. So it doesn't have a home yet. It's very
Yeah.
early. Um, so I like to share the little anecdote that the final version of this novel, the final manuscript, was due, and this is not a joke, it was literally due on the due date of my second child. Like it was the same day. Um, so it was a big due date. And so I have, you know, um, I had a very different rhythm of my life in the past couple of years that, it's just been not as focused on new writing. But recently I got inspired with this new idea that I'm playing with that is it's in the adult speculative space. So it's not
Oh,
young adult. And it grapples with some of the same environmental themes, but it's also near future, but it's much more in the realm of like from the position of a mother,
oh,
obviously. That's
yeah.
like where my mind is right now. Um, and it also is much more in kind of like deals with that relationship of someone who is in the Cuban diaspora. So it definitely like is dealing more with those cultural heritage questions. And you had sent me this list of questions that you
Yeah.
like as authors, and one of those questions that I liked was, um, what is a question that no one asks you that you wish you would be asked? And I'm going to cheat a little bit because it's a question that one person has asked me, but I really liked it. And because it kind of opened my mind up to think about it. It was something I had never thought about before. And their question was, did you write Under This Forgetful Sky before or after you had children? And if you wrote it after you had children, would it have been a different book if you'd written it when you had children? And I was
Wow.
like, wow, that's a really interesting question. And when I thought about it, I realized when I was writing that novel, I was so much in the headspace of those characters. I was getting into that very like
Mhm.
teenager headspace and like what it would feel like to be in that position. Editing the novel after I had already had my first child, I realized I was reading this more as a mother and being like, oh my gosh, these poor children, what have I put them through? They're just kids. Like, and so I was so grateful actually that when I wrote the novel originally, that I wrote it pre-children
Yeah.
because I could see the world more through that lens of being a young person navigating the world on their own terms. Because I think I would have written a very different book had I written it post kids. But now that I have kids, the subject position that I feel myself really needing to write about is being a mother in this world where you don't know what's going to happen in the future, and that kind of uncertainty and fear and hope and all of that stuff mixed together. So that's where I'm writing now. Yeah.
Well, that's good. Well, it sounds like you've got some plans to go, and this has been really, it's been great to get to know you and get some of your ideas out in the world. We'll we need to keep in touch as this goes forward, as you do this. I'm looking forward to curating this conversation and getting it out in the world so that people can do that. I hope you continue to shop this book though, because I think it deserves some more attention, and as you hit conferences or get it into state contests and stuff, I think that'll be great.
Thank
Well,
you.
Lauren, it's been wonderful to talk with you.
You too. And I do have some resources for teachers on my website if there are teachers that see this and are curious. I've got some just like discussion questions and essay questions that I've put up as little resources that teachers can use as part of their plans if they ever wanted to use this book in the classroom.
That's great, and that's always a help when people have those things. So it's a good help to know that there's other resources than just yourself when you're
Yeah.
teaching.
Yeah.
Sometimes that wears thin a little
Yes.
bit.
I know from experience for sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.